series that we call Current Issues in Bioethics. Our guest lecturer today is Dr. Jeffrey Bishop. You can Google his credentials as an MD internist, a PhD philosopher, as director of the Gnaegi Center for Healthcare Ethics at St. Louis University, as the author of a highly acclaimed publication in 2011 titled The Anticipatory Corpse. The Anticipatory Corpse. Medicine, Power, and Care of the Dying. You can Google all that, but what you really need to know about Jeff Bishop is that he comes to us here in Missouri as an immigrant from the Republic of Texas.
That's right.
Any other immigrants from the Republic of Texas here today? Yeah. A few of you. You can all get together and speak Texan a little bit later. Dr. Bishop was born and raised on a farm in Texas. He was educated and trained wholly in Texas. Where else? So he's definitely a foreigner to Kansas City, but he acculturates well, and we welcome him here. Please welcome with me to KCU, Dr. Jeffrey Bishop.
Thanks, Terry. Is this on? Can you hear me okay? All right, perfect. I also like to move around a lot, and I wonder if there's a way to forward slides and everything. Yes, awesome. All right. Well, it's great. I came over from St. Louis. There's a joke that Kansas City is where the West begins, and St. Louis is where the East peters out. So it's good to be in a place that has beginnings. All right, so I'm interested in medicine, technology, and how those things work together and how they construct our way of thinking about the world, because they do shape the way we think about the world. But not only that, we shape the way we think about ourselves in light of technology. Okay? It used to be that we thought of the brain as something that had pressures and drives in the 19th century because we talked about the brain analogously to the steam engine. Okay? Today we talk about the brain analogously to the computer. Okay? So our metaphors for the way we think about the brain is the metaphor of a computer, where it used to be some other form of technology, the steam engine. Okay? So that shapes the way we think about neuroscience. And I like to tell, this is a very, very famous scientist. His name was Mikhail Polanyi. He was a physical chemist, a physician, a physical chemist who left all of that behind to become a social and political philosopher. And he said this: scientific maxims and the art of interpreting them may be said to constitute the premises of science, but I prefer to call them our scientific beliefs. These premises, our beliefs, are embodied in a tradition, the tradition of science. Now, what most of you probably aren't aware of is that in the history of the rise of modern science, especially in the 1500s and 1600s, scientists were constantly saying things like, we do not adhere to traditions. We want to throw the traditions out and think about the realities of the world. We're more interested in reality than tradition, because tradition can bias us. And yet, at the turn of the 18th to the 19th century, Mikhail Polanyi says this, that science itself is embedded in tradition. And it doesn't just have reason, it has beliefs. Okay? He was a brilliant physical chemist. In fact, two of his postdoc students went on to win Nobel Prizes in chemistry out of his lab. That's how important this guy was. All right. So what I'm going to do is we're going to have 4 movements today. The first movement is look at early modern politics and science. Hold on one second. Let me just check something. Yeah, that's right. Forgive me. I wanted to make sure I had the slides in the right order. All right. So 4 movements. I'm going to look at the history of early modern philosophy, which is the history of early modern science. Okay? And we're going to look at the relationship of politics to science, just briefly. Then we're going to go to a second movement, which I call philosophy of social science. Philosophy of social science is actually important for people who are going to practice medicine. You use it all the time. And I'm going to kind of show you how scientific knowledge, social scientific knowledge, gets constructed. And it gets constructed for certain kinds of purposes, including political purposes. And then I'm going to say that neuroscience is really a correlation between two different sciences, neurobiology on the one hand and social science on the other. And then we're going to look at what is so problematic with this idea of using technoscience and taking this neuroscience and beginning to try to think about what can be done with it. Okay? All right, who can read French? What does it say? Yes. Okay. What does it say? He just pulled you on the mat, man. Sorry about that.
So this here is not a pipe.
This is not a pipe. Okay. This is not a pipe. And in many ways, you know, of course, that's true and false in so many ways. It's kind of interesting because it's really not a pipe. It's a painting of a pipe. And it's actually not even a painting of a pipe. It's an image of a painting of a pipe, right? All right. The problem with empirical knowledge is that it gives us the illusion that we know what we're talking about, okay? So let's keep that in mind as we move forward. The problem with empirical knowledge is that it gives us the illusion that we know what we're talking about. All right, the greatest minds, the greatest scientific minds of the 15 and 1600s into the 1700s were also the greatest political minds of that era, okay? So, Thomas Hobbes was a geometrician who studied physics. He has all these writings on early physics, okay? But we know him as the author, or many people, maybe not all of us in the room, but we know him as the father of the social contract theory of politics, okay? And Thomas Hobbes wrote a great book called Leviathan, and it is a great book. It is very thick, okay? So he was also the chancellor, or the secretary to the chancellor of the Exchequer in early modern Britain, okay? In addition to that, you should know this guy named John Locke. He was a physician who thought of himself as a natural philosopher, who we know as the author of 2 treatises on government. And the 2 treatises on government are the very thing upon which the American Constitution and the American founding are built. Okay? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. John Locke says life, liberty, and property are the foundation of our rights. Okay? So John Locke was not only a physician and a scientist, a natural philosopher. They would have been called scientists, natural philosophers at that time. But he was the author of essentially the American political experiment. Okay? But I'm interested in another guy named Francis Bacon. And Bacon was a political operative his entire life. He was the chancellor of the Exchequer. He predates both Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. In fact, Thomas Hobbes was Bacon's secretary. Okay? And he was the chancellor to the Exchequer. And he's also wrote a book called The New Organon. And he's the father of modern empiricism, okay? He's also the father of modern technoscience. He's essentially, in a way, the intellectual father of contemporary medicine in many ways, okay? But he was a political operative his entire life, and he wrote a book called The New Organon. And in that book, he makes 2 claims about something called the epistemological justification for knowledge. How do you know that something is true? Okay, how do we know that something is true? Well, he says, if you can take the things that you know and enact them in the world and make the world behave according to the way you think, you know you've got the truth. That in philosophy is known as an epistemological justification. Okay? But he also says that you have a moral justification as well. And the moral justification for the knowledge that you're gaining and the knowledge that you want to implement is if you can relieve the human estate of its frailties, okay? If you can relieve the human estate of its frailties. So we have an epistemological justification if you can do stuff with it, but also a moral justification if you can do good stuff with the knowledge. And in fact, to this day in patent law, the definition of what is patentable information is if you can take that information and do something with it in the world. Okay? So these guys actually shaped our way of thinking about the world. All right? So politics and science have always been linked together, is what I'm trying to say. And I'm going to show you how that gets linked together in contemporary neuroscience. So here's Polanyi again. No inanimate object is ever fully determined by the laws of physics and chemistry. Okay? So let's keep that in mind. And then one of my favorite quotes that I use often, and my students get sick of it: objects do not go into their concepts without leaving a remainder. That's a hard thing. Objects do not go into their concepts without leaving a remainder. What he means by that is the things that we think we know exceed or greater than our knowing them. Okay? So our knowing is derivative from the things, but our knowing does not exhaust the things themselves, is what he's saying. So let's keep that in mind as we move forward as well. All right. So the second movement is what I call the philosophy of social science. And when you're doing the philosophy of social science, it's a little bit harder to do social science than it is to do regular science, like a rock. A rock is right there. You've got a rock, you can see the rock, you can get your hands on it. But have you ever thought about intelligence? Can you get your hands on intelligence? It's a more nebulous thing. Or let's take something else like antisocial personality, right? It's a harder thing to get your hands on. It's not like a rock. It's not just sitting there waiting for you to measure it and to size it up and to break it apart. So social objects or psychological objects are different than physical objects. So we have a different way of doing social science. Now, the first step whenever you're trying to figure out what an antisocial personality disorder is, the very first step, is you have to have what's called a conceptual definition of antisocial personality disorder or of intelligence. So let's take the IQ test, because it's the one that most of you are probably familiar with, right? When it was first created, they first had to come up with a definition, a conceptual definition of what intelligence is, okay? I mean, think about, what is intelligence? I mean, if you had to list some characteristics of intelligence, what would they be? But the first people who came up with the IQ test had to do that, okay? And of course, they said, well, the students at Harvard, those are intelligent people, right? And so they come up with a test then. They have to come up with that conceptual definition that has all of the characteristics of intelligence. And then they have to come up with what is called an operational definition. And an operational definition is essentially looking for the operations, the questions you will ask, in order to pick out an instance of intelligence in the world, okay? So the first, you don't know what intelligence is. You come up with a conceptual definition, and then you say, okay, now I've got to be able to test that conceptual definition against the world, against real intelligence. So we're going to give this test to a bunch of Harvard students because they are clearly the most intelligent people, all right? And then we're going to say, okay, wow, look at this. The Harvard kids got these questions right, all right? So this must be picking out intelligence, and we're going to give it to the Mizzou kids, all right? Not quite as bright, all right? Sorry, Mizzou people. And we're going to say, oh, look, they didn't score as high. We must be testing intelligence here, right? But then the Mizzou kids got some of the questions right. And it was like, well, if the Mizzou kids got those questions right, they can't be that hard. So anybody would get them right. So we're going to throw those questions out, okay? So they begin to winnow away at the operational definition, and they give this test over and over and over, all right, until they start to throw out the bad questions that don't distinguish between the non-intelligent and the intelligent, all right, according to the conceptual definition. And eventually, if the test doesn't work, we begin to redefine intelligence itself. We change the conceptual definition. Now, in the philosophy of social science, they refer to this as conceptual funneling, okay? In other words, you just kind of winnow away until you get a better and better sort of object, like antisocial personality, right? You get a better definition, a better test, Beck's depression inventory, right? All of these things start out with a conceptual definition, followed by an operational definition, followed by a refining of that definition, a conceptual funneling. Or is it an epistemological circuit where you're just chasing your tail, right? In other words, it's not measuring anything about the world, but it's measuring the test itself, right? So that then is what social science does. So let's keep that in mind as we move forward. So what neuroscience is this complicated process between neurobiology, looking at fMRI studies, looking at the brain, right? Or looking at the way action potentials, translate across an axon, right? Or how they move along the axon. And you take those social scientific concepts and those tests and you begin to kind of correlate them with neuroscientific or neurobiological concepts. Now think about that for a minute. Science is a very difficult process. It's a hard thing to do, okay? It's not a hard thing to know. Science is really easy to know. But the process of picking out something that you can say is true about a brain is hard enough. Try to pick out a concept that says something true about psychopathy or depression, and it's even harder. And then you try to take those two sciences and put them together, and it becomes even harder to say what's true. Okay? So neuroscience is a very, very complicated process of the biological sciences and the social sciences, making it very difficult to make truth claims about the brain, particularly about behaviors. All right? Sorry, this slide is I always mean to change the color on it, but it doesn't do very well, so forgive me. All right, so now we're going to look at some actual neuroscience, okay? And there was this, we knew for a fact that there is a polymorphism in the promoter region of monoamine oxidase A. Now, what a polymorphism is a naturally occurring difference in the promoter region of a protein, a sequence for a protein that controls neurotransmitter function, okay? A polymorphism is something that happens in nature all the time. It's a functional gene. In other words, it works, but it doesn't work as well as it works in you. So mine may not work as well as it works in you guys, okay? That's just a polymorphism. It's naturally occurring. I'm able to function. It doesn't lead to my death, right? And it seems to persist in the population, so it has what evolutionary theorists call inclusive fitness. In other words, it's not selected out as a deleterious bad gene, so to speak. But it turns out that if you have a polymorphism in the promoter region of monoamine oxidase A, there's a high chance, not even close to 100%, there's a correlation between that and being able to be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. So we use one of those tests to measure antisocial personality disorder, and what do we know? There's a correlation, a strong likelihood that these two things are related to each other. All right? So on the one hand, the polymorphism, and on the other hand, antisocial personality disorder. All right? These guys, Meyer, Lindenberg, and all of his crowd, his scientists, said, well, what is the missing link between this polymorphism and the diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder? And they scanned some people's brains, 97 people who had the polymorphism in the promoter region of monoamine oxidase A, and they noticed something. Their amygdala were thinner and smaller in size than yours. All right? In addition to that, functionally speaking, it's not just structurally smaller, it is also more hyper-responsive. And all of you, as good second-year students, you know what that means, right? Amygdala, fight or flight, right? So if you have a smaller amygdala that is more hyper-responsive, it fires off at the drop of a hat, just like that, you're going to fly off the handle a little bit more easily. You're going to get scared and want to fight more. Antisocial personality disorder, right? In addition to that, not only does the amygdala, is it thinner and functions more hyper-responsively, the cingulate gyrus is sluggish. And the cingulate gyrus puts the brakes on the amygdala. All right? We found the missing link. We go from genes to brains to behavior. All right? Genes to brain to behavior. The problem is this. They scanned the heads of 97 people who had the polymorphism in the promoter region of monoamine oxidase A, but not one of them had been diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. In other words, behaviorally speaking, they were completely normal. Okay? Let's move on to another scientific study. Now this one is really, this slide's okay to read. All right, this was done by Caspi et al., and I think it was published in the Archives of General Psychiatry or something like that. And what they did is they went to New Zealand. New Zealand is notorious for having really very well-kept social service records, okay? So if a kid gets put into the social service system, they have data that they collect from those kids for 20 plus years, okay? So they took some blood from these kids, and these are now 20-something-year-old people now, okay? So these are people who they've entered into the social service system at the age of 5. They've been following for 20 years, okay? And they've got lots of social scientific data on these kids, but they also have blood on these kids, okay? And so they tried to see if there is a correlation between something in their behavior and the environment in which they grew up. And these kids also had the polymorphism, some of them had the polymorphism in the promoter region of monoamine oxidase A. All right? And so what they found is that if you had no childhood maltreatment, all right, you are no more likely to be diagnosed, if you have the polymorphism, you are no more likely to be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder than if you had no childhood maltreatment and did not have the polymorphism. Okay? If you had probable childhood maltreatment and you had the polymorphism in the promoter region of monoamine oxidase A, that one right up there, doesn't work, you'll notice that those two numbers are actually really close together. You're no more likely to be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. There's no statistically significant difference in the probable maltreatment group. However, if they had documented severe maltreatment, all right, and they had the polymorphism, you see that those curves begin to separate. And there is a statistically significant difference between those two groups. So in other words, the science itself problematizes Meyer-Lindenberg, right? Because Meyer-Lindenberg said we go genes to brains to behavior. And here we say, no, it's not genes to brains to behavior. It's genes that grow up in a certain kind of environment that might shape the brain, right? That might lead to something like antisocial personality disorder. In addition to that, you'll notice that even in those who are completely normal, they have normal monoamine oxidase A activity, there's a trend upward to being diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. Okay? So in other words, the story is infinitely more complicated than that. Okay? In addition to that, there's a problem with the antisocial behavior indices that can be used. Okay? One of the most famous ones is called Robert Hare created something he calls the Psychopathy Test. Okay? And that psychopathy test has been problematized over and over and over. So they've already got a social scientific definition of psychopathy or antisocial personality disorder that shapes the way that they think about science, okay, and what are the kind of truth claims that can be made about it, okay? Now, these have been reproduced by a woman at the University of Illinois in Chicago named Naomi Sadeh. So this seems to be a pretty important sort of indicator that it's not just genes, but genes in a certain kind of social environment that lead to certain kinds of diagnoses. All right? So in what sense is a functional polymorphism a disorder if there are people who never express the disorder, right? How do we try to think about these things? Why is there so much hype on the neuroscience when it doesn't necessarily pan out the way that they claim that it does? Okay? And it's not just on the pathological side with antisocial personality disorder. It's not on the pathological side with Hare psychopathy test. It also turns out to be true on the positive psychology test that they begin to try to think about these things. And I want you to notice something here. This study, they're trying to look at the definition of wisdom. And so what they did was they said, look, let's look on the positive side of psychiatry, and let's look at wisdom. And so they came up with a very interesting sort of way of defining what wisdom is. So remember, we have to have a conceptual definition. So the way they construct their conceptual definition is they found 10 definitions already in existence in the literature. Okay? So they took each of those 10 definitions and they began to say, now what do those 10 definitions have in common? And so if, of those 10 definitions, if 3 of them had the same thing listed, then that was going to be one of the subcomponents of the definition of wisdom. Okay? So it turns out that of the 10 definitions of wisdom that they found in the psychological literature, 5 of them had something that looked kind of like prosocial attitudes and behaviors, and so prosocial attitudes and behaviors become part of their definition of wisdom. Okay? Then they went to the next one, social decision-making, pragmatic knowledge of life. So if of the 10 definitions, if 3 of them had something like social decision-making and pragmatic knowledge of life as part of their definition, then it made the list. And if anything had fewer than 3, it didn't get on the list. Okay? So this is how they came up with it. And notice something. We've been talking about antisocial personality disorder, and now on this list we see prosocial attitudes and behaviors. Okay? So what happens in the neuroscientific literature is we see that antisocial personality disorder becomes a stand-in for vice, and prosocial attitudes and behaviors become a stand-in for virtue. All right? But let's look at how they came up with this definition. So let's just take prosocial attitudes and behaviors as our first subcomponent, okay? So what they did is they started looking at these definitions, and these are the 5 definitions they came up with that they found in the literature that had something like prosocial attitudes and behavior. Now, if you look up the definition of wisdom in the literature, you're going to find 500 definitions. They picked 10 definitions in the psychological literature, okay? They chose a guy named Baltus. Baltus is a German cognitive psychologist who has 30 years worth of data on studying wisdom. Okay? He's a very, very good social psychologist, cognitive psychologist. Okay? They chose a definition from the proceedings of the Iowa Society for Psychology or something like that. Baltus has a huge literature. So why pick a little definition in the Iowa Society of Psychology? Why not pick one of his more robust publications? The other thing was Ardelt was a woman who she has a definition of wisdom as well, but she's an affective psychologist. She's not a cognitive psychologist. And the cognitivists and the affective psychologists fight with each other constantly about whose definition ought to work, okay? So they use opposing definitions of wisdom in order to come up with their definition of wisdom on the social attitudes, pro-social attitudes and behaviors subcomponent, okay? They use a study from a guy named Brown and Green. And Brown and Green work at a small liberal arts university in the psychology department. And I don't know if you remember doing this, but back in the day when I was in Psychology 101, one of the things that we were required to do in order to get credit for the course is that we had to participate in research. In other words, we had to be research subjects ourselves. All right? And they would ask us a bunch of questions or ask us what we would do in certain kinds of situations. Well, that's what they did here, okay? That's what they did here, is they took a bunch of college students and asked them, what's your definition of wisdom? And the college students would give a definition. Now, I don't know if you've been on a college campus on a Friday night with freshmen, right? Wisdom is not something you'd think you'd find there, right? Not a lot of wisdom going around, all right? But yet that's one of their sub-definitions, okay? In addition to that, Sternberg is a philosopher of psychology, and he has a certain kind of definition. And he had something kind of like pro-social attitudes and behaviors on his list. In addition to that, they did this person named Jason. He did a study in which he asked his professor friends who they thought was wise. And they would give definitions like Mahatma Gandhi or Jesus Christ or Martin Luther King Jr. And then they'd say, well, what did you think was wise about those people? And they would come up with a definition that way. But they also, one of the people listed, and not just Mahatma Gandhi and Jesus Christ and Martin Luther King Jr., they listed a free-roaming whale as the pinnacle of wisdom, okay? It's kind of a strange definition. But I want you to look at something else about these 6 subcomponents. These 6 subcomponents are, I mean, when I look at them, I think, you know what? This is a good liberal Democrat's definition of wisdom, right? If you asked a libertarian, what definition of wisdom would you come up with? Some of these things might be on that list, but other things like self-starter might be on that list, or personal responsibility might be on that list, right? And so based on your political persuasion, you might have a different list of virtues that show up on your list, all right? So now let's go on to what Meeks and Jesty did. They then said, well, let's look at take our definition of wisdom, and let's begin to try to figure out what neurotransmitters are associated with each of these subcomponents of the definition of wisdom. And so what we find is that oxytocin, vasopressin, serotonin, and dopamine have something to do with pro-social attitudes and behaviors. Emotional homeostasis is related to dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine. And what they did is they list out here in this findings side of the table. Those are all of the studies that they're referencing, saying that sure enough, when so-and-so studied dopamine, that dopamine, they were looking at pro-social attitudes and behaviors. They had a slightly different definition, but it looked something like pro-social attitudes and behaviors. In other words, they're taking their virtues and beginning to map them onto the genome, onto the neurotransmitters, okay? They went a step further, Meeks and Jesty did, and they began to say, okay, now where is it in the brain that we can find these virtues? We can find that pro-social attitudes and behavior is associated with moral sensitivity, which we can isolate to the posterior cingulate cortex, okay? Pro-social attitudes and behavior, self-other differentiation is found in the superior temporal sulcus. So they're taking these social ideas, these politically motivated ideas, and beginning to map them onto the brain, okay? Beginning to say, look, this is where this is. Now, who of you has heard of the so-called, oh, sorry, that's a bad slide, forgive me. Who of you has heard of the so-called science of phrenology? Who's heard of phrenology? So what is phrenology? Anyone, shout it out, it's okay. That's right. All right, so they believed that you could literally go and measure skulls and the shapes of the skulls and began to figure out who had superior intelligence. And this was a science that took place from, but kind of found its origins in the late 1800s and moved all the way into the early 20th century. And they had skull calipers and things like that to help you make a decision, because you could tell what kind of person they were going to be. And it turns out, according to this so-called science, right, if you had a kind of mongoloid skull, you were going to be very intelligent, but not as industrious as the Anglo white skulls. All right? And if you had an African skull, right, an African shape, well, you weren't actually, you were meant for manual labor and not for any sort of intellectual endeavors. All right? Political ideas getting mapped onto skulls. Political ideas getting mapped onto brains. Okay? We've got a phrenology going on here, folks, and it's scary. All right? So, lest you think it's not scary, Sam Harris says, if our well-being depends upon the interaction between events in our brains and events in the world, there are better and worse ways to secure it. Then some cultures will tend to produce lives that are more worth living than others. Some political persuasions will be more enlightened than others. And some worldviews will be mistaken in ways that cause needless human harm. And guess what? They're all just like us. The really bright ones. They're Western, they're educated, they come from industrial societies that are rich, and they're usually found in democracies. They're weirdos, in other words. Western, educated, industrial, rich Democrats, okay? And white, for the most part, okay? So what we see then are certain ideas that are beginning to shape our way of thinking about neuroscience, events of brains and events in the world, right? And this is why our neuroscience has a political slant to it, and that's why it's troubling. And of course, we always couch this in terms of doing good, because we're good Baconians, right? Remember I said Bacon said the moral justification of knowledge, that we're going to do good with it, okay? Well, here's Meeks and Jesty, the guys who've tried to map prosocial attitudes and behavior onto the brain. Wisdom is considered an important contributor to successful personal and social functioning. Understanding the neurobiology of wisdom may have considerable clinical significance. In other words, we're going to do good with this, folks. For example, knowledge of the underlying mechanisms could potentially lead to the development of preventive, therapeutic, and rehabilitative interventions for enhancing wisdom, including those designed for persons with relevant neuropsychiatric disorders, for example, dementia, frontotemporal dementia, okay? But also antisocial personality disorder, right? Also those who have the correct prosocial attitudes and behaviors, all right? And, now I want to advance, there it is. And lest you get a little bit spookier, these are just a handful of the last 5 to 7 years. The amount of literature on this has exploded, okay? So they say, look, we need to enhance genetic virtue. In other words, if you happen to have the polymorphism in the promoter region of monoamine oxidase A, we want to alert you to that, because you may not want to pass that gene along to your children, even though that gene only has a slight correlation with creating an antisocial personality, right? So they want to say, look, let's start to screen genes and not implant those. Now think about it though. I said this had inclusive fitness, right? In other words, it has some sort of herd protective mechanism that is at work when you have certain numbers of people with the polymorphism. In other words, if you live in a culture in which you're constantly at war, like the United States, you might want some people who have quick trigger fingers, right? People who respond quickly, who shoot first and ask questions later. Because it has inclusive fitness. It's good for the herd if you have those kinds of people, right? Unless you want to weed those out, okay? So we're starting to mess with evolutionary processes that work themselves out over millennia, okay? We're starting to think that we can design our own evolution, is what this is doing. And we're enacting certain kinds of values, certain kinds of virtues in doing that. We need to morally enhance, because some of you are immoral people, and we're going to cognitively enhance. We're going to be so cognitively enhanced. Let's face it, folks. This is a terrible interface with my little handheld device. The finger, right? I'm pushing things all the time. It's a terrible interface. Imagine if we can just think it. Implant devices so that we can think it and therefore pull up certain kinds of knowledge, right? We're going to cognitively enhance. We're going to make all of you so incredibly intelligent. And if you're not moral, if you're not a weirdo, right, you might use that for bad things. So we're going to have to morally enhance you first, because some of you are immoral. Okay? So this is what is out there. This is what I think is a little bit scary, is the political dimension that shapes the knowledge that we map onto the brain and then think that we can turn around and do something about it. And we will be able to do some things like this, okay? These are technical difficulties that we'll overcome, because we always overcome technical difficulties, all right? So Albert Einstein said, science can only ascertain what is, but not what should be. And outside of its domain, outside the domain of science, value judgments of all kinds remain necessary. What I've just said is that Albert Einstein is wrong. There aren't just facts and values out there. But in fact, we morally shape our facts, the things we claim to be scientifically true, especially about brains and especially about behaviors. What we claim to be true, the facts, are politically and morally laden facts. In other words, they're not just pure facts, just natural things sitting out there for us to find. We actually construct them. We actually make them into facts through this process of social scientific conceptual funneling. Okay? So even Albert Einstein can be wrong. And so, that says, this is not a brain. This is not a brain. It's not a brain. It's an image of a brain. And not only is it an image of the brain, you give the brain glucose, because the brain only uses glucose, as you know, right? It only uses glucose to get its energy source, as its energy source. And then we label that glucose in a certain way such that we can tell where that glucose is being taken up in the brain. And then in addition to that, we take that and we take a digital image of it, and we look for where that glucose is being taken up, okay? And if you're thinking about playing tennis, then it's going to be taken up in the tennis playing area of the brain, or so the story goes, right? And then what they do is they say, well, what amount of energy is being released at that pixel in that digital image? What amount of energy is being released at that pixel? And then they look at the neighboring pixel, all right? And they say, okay, what amount of energy is being released there? And then they do statistical calculations between that pixel and all of the other surrounding pixels. And they look for a difference. And then they begin to color it where there's a lot of activity, all right? And they give high activity the color of red. And they give low activity the color of blue. And they give everything in between, so that they then create a representation of the brain. But it ain't a brain. It's glucose activity. It's blood flow. It's something else. It's not the brain, all right? Now, we make inferences that it goes back to the brain in some way, but those are huge inferences, right? Huge judgments that we make in that. But it's certainly not a virtue or a vice. It's not an antisocial personality disorder or a prosocial attitudes and behavior. And so, as I said at the beginning, the problem with empiricism is it gives us the illusion that we know what we're talking about. And I'm claiming that in neuroscience, we are creating all kinds of illusions that we know what we're talking about, and they're politically charged. I'll stop there, and you can ask questions, throw rocks, whatever you would like. Thank you very much.
So eugenics never stopped.
Eugenics never stopped. And one of the things we need to remember, so she said eugenics never stopped, and that's exactly right. Eugenics didn't stop. And we have to remember that we, the Americans and the Brits, are the guys that came up with eugenics, not the Nazis. The Nazis just took the ideas and ran with it, all right? It was our idea. And it continued well after the Nuremberg trials, okay? And they changed all the names of the departments from the Department of Eugenics to departments of anthropology or the departments of genetics. Doesn't mean the attitudes changed in there, okay? And I belong to a couple of Facebook groups for transhumanists, and they're constantly putting things up that we're gonna create artificial wombs, and we're gonna create genetically enhanced babies that have more intelligence and that have certain skin colors and certain eye colors, right? That's a very clever way of saying race, right? Certain eye colors and certain skin colors, along with intelligence, that we're going to be able to select out. So eugenics did not go away. And in fact, there have even been people who've tried to rehab the word eugenics because it just means good genes. We all want good genes, right? And so people are trying to rehab the ideas and to implement them, and they just keep coming back. So there might be something about Western science and Western political ideas that shape our Western science, okay? Now that's scientists, no, I just got facts here, right? No, they're morally laden facts, especially when it comes to social science. So yeah, eugenics never went away. Other questions or comments? Yes, sir. Let me see if I can turn this on. There, I think it's on.
Thank you. So, kind of going along with that, with these morally and politically laden sort of, I guess, motivations behind social science, I mean, how do you escape that? I mean, it doesn't really seem like you can get to a point where you can practice some type of social science or some type of progress in that area without, removing someone's type of moral or political biases.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I'm not saying that you can ever actually get rid of it, right? I'm saying it's always already politically constituted, right? So we just have to be aware of it. The problem is that we aren't necessarily aware of it. We just think, these are just facts, right? So the whole point is to make us aware of the fact that all science is politically and morally constituted. We ask, why do we know so much about heart disease? Because the old white guys who were dying of heart disease were in charge of medical schools in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. Why do we know so little about breast cancer? Because there weren't a lot of professors getting breast cancer, okay? So our social ideas inevitably shape our science and the kinds of questions that we ask, okay? So that's the point, is that we have to be very careful about what it is that we're going to do. And we may have to, we like sexy toys, we like technology. We really like technology. And so if you can do something, I mean, when I was on the faculty at Vanderbilt, I was talking to students. This was when Obama was before Obama was elected in 2008. And they were told to look at Obama's, or look at the various health plans of any of the candidates at that time. It could have been Obama or who was it at that time? McCain, I guess it was, and see which plans you like. And they all chose Obama's, and I said, fantastic, all of you are going to go be primary care doctors now because Obama is calling for primary care doctors. And they were like, no, we're Vanderbilt students, we came into this because we like science and technology, right? So the problem is this with technology is that it has a certain political and moral valence, and if all you have is a hammer, a tool, a certain kind of technology, everything looks like a nail, right? Everything looks like a nail. And this is the problem, is we start thinking in certain political ways as if that is the only way to think about it because it's the scientific truth. So we actually have to be more sophisticated about what it is that science does. And that means doing some philosophy of science and being critical of the studies you read. You remember, empirical knowledge constantly deludes us, right? It can be elusive. It gives us the illusion that we know what we're talking about. Okay, so we have to be careful. Other questions or comments? Yes, sir.
Just thinking about how politics and other, aspects will affect science. How do you think that we could get away from this when usually most science is controlled a lot by whether you get a grant, like a government grant to politicians are controlling how much money you get, or a corporation wants to fund your drug study, or this politician wants you to study this certain aspect.
Yeah.
And you want the money.
Exactly right. So if you're in order to get a grant to do your studies, you have to look at what the grant funder, so most of the time it's the NIH, you have to look at what they want to fund, okay? Now sometimes they will have reasonably good social and political reasons for wanting to study certain kinds of diseases or certain kinds of things. All right? And so the government will use money to entice scientists to go and study those things, okay? So it can be used for the social good or some sort of notion of the common good, which itself is a problematic concept, okay? Just so you know, it's really hard to know what the common good is. And then you've got industry that's pushing it in a certain way too. And if you've ever had to apply for a grant, which I imagine some of your professors will have done, it is an incredibly tedious process to where you have to learn how to say things so that the granting agency won't kick you out immediately, right? So that it becomes sort of politically aligned with the direction of the study. The problem is this: a lot of the technology that we study, especially neuroscientific technology, is funded. One of the largest funders of neuroscientific technology, do you know what it is? The Department of Defense. Department of Defense. Because we want soldiers who don't come back with PTSD. So maybe if we could get a drug or a sort of implantable device or something that kind of turns off the traumatic portion so that they don't sustain the trauma, they can go out and fight the wars. Or we're going to create an exoskeleton for them with a machine-brain interface so that they can run with that exoskeleton, that they can fight the wars better. But of course, it's going to be good for people who are paralyzed too, okay? So these things get all mired up in certain political and economic ideas, just as you pointed out. So it's just difficult. But we have to be aware of it. We can't pretend like science is just giving us the truth and just falling out of the sky. Here it is. It's always politically and economically constructed. So the point is to be aware of that. I think we're supposed to end at 11:50. Is that right? Or do you any more questions, comments? Going once. Going twice. You get to show off your brilliance. We're done. Thank you.